How we doing, everybody? Dr. Stringer back to you this week with Module 13. We're talking about sentencing again. This week you didn't have any, particularly readings from the chapter, but you were reading those two summaries of articles that are at the end of the sentencing chapter. Those might have been a little bit more challenging for you when it came to the findings and basically what the articles found. So I wanted to make sure I went through that stuff with you all. For those of you that haven't taken research methods and have any experience interpreting statistical models, because that can be a bit cumbersome there, and the authors do a pretty good job of kind of changing some of the lingo in there to make it a little clearer, but I thought I should go through those a little bit and talk to you guys about it. So with that said, we will talk about the Spohn and Belinko article about doing drugs and doing the time first, and then we'll move on to the second one, and we'll talk about that one briefly. So Spohn and Belinko, the basic purposes of their studies were they wanted to look at hard drug use and whether a person's history of drug use or drug use at the time they committed the crime had anything to do with their case outcomes once they went to court. And so they looked at three main outcomes. The first one being pretrial detention. So when they were arrested, were they detained? They put in jail until their trial and sentencing and all that, or were they allowed to be bonded out of jail until trial and all of those sorts of things. Also, they looked at downward departures for substantial assistance. For those of you that don't know, we haven't really covered it in class that much. It's more of a prosecutorial and investigative thing. But this is basically somebody who cooperates, a cooperating witness. So somebody who, in exchange for a more lenient sentence, gives the police and the prosecutors information on perhaps the person they were getting the drugs from, or perhaps other people that might be involved in the criminal organization that's trafficking the drugs, things like that. This happens a lot because when people get faced with federal charges for drugs, they're going to possibly be going away for a long time. The DEA loves to sit them down and talk to them about this, and they will give them a more lenient sentence, as you've probably seen in the media sometimes, in exchange for cooperation. And this is how the DEA conducts a lot of their investigations in order to get those higher up people in the drug organizations. You don't really want to focus so much on getting those people that might be using the drugs. You want to get the people that are selling them, the bigger distributors, and then maybe even possibly the people that are trafficking them into the country, or even in many instances creating the drugs. When you think about meth labs and things like that. Anyway, that's a discussion for a policing course. But anyway, and then the third outcome that they looked at was sentence length. So when they got sentenced, how long was their sentence? Were they given, a year? Were they given 10 years? Were they given 20 years? All those sorts of things. So the results actually showed they had a little bit of mixed support for their hypotheses, and I don't think the book really goes in to talk about the hypotheses too much, but they're hypothesizing that either hard drug use during the time the crime was committed, or having a history of hard drug use is going to have some sort of effect on these court outcomes, being pretrial detention, substantial assistance, or sentence length. So what they found was that drugs during the crime, when you commit a crime and you were doing drugs during the time you committed that crime, you are much more likely to be given pretrial detention. So you're probably going to be detained if you were using drugs during the time you committed the crime. The judge is going to take that into account and probably think you might be a danger to yourself or society if you're using drugs when you committed the crime. However, they found that if you have a history of drug use, that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be more likely to get a pretrial detention than someone that doesn't have a history of drug use, which is interesting. However, both history of drug use and current drug use were both significant predictors of substantial assistance departures. And this makes a lot of sense, right? If you think about people that have used drugs or using drugs, or have a history of using drugs, they're going to have a lot more information that they could potentially give the prosecutors or the investigators in order to get this departure, in order to substantially assist the DEA agents or the people, whatever entity is investigating you, right? If you haven't done many drugs or been involved with that, then you're not going to have much to tell them. And this goes to the fact, too, that I talked about, that substantial assistance departures are mainly used with drug investigations. And that gets into a little bit more law enforcement. But, with other crimes, maybe you're a serial killer or something like that, they don't really want to give you a substantial assistance departure. Maybe if you have an accomplice and you weren't the primary person that was killing people, they might, but it's very unlikely. And it's very rare as well. It's most likely to occur with these drug offenses. So it makes sense that having a history of drug use or doing drugs during the commission of your crime is going to be related to that, and you're going to possibly have more to give them. And so now the next thing to think about, though, is that neither current drug use during the commission of the crime or having a history of drug use was directly related to sentencing. So those coefficients would be insignificant in those models that were presented. Just leave it at that for the direct relationship. However, what they do talk about, and what I wanted to make sure that I mentioned to you all, because I can imagine it can be a little bit confusing if you don't understand the statistical process going on there, is they did find that drug use, both current and during the commission of the crime, as well as the history of drug use, was indirectly related to sentence length. And I put this little map down here at the bottom here that says history of drug use or current drug use is related to sentencing departures, right? So as we set up at the top there, so if you were doing drugs during the crime, or you had a history of drug use, you are more likely to get a substantial assistance departure. Well, part of substantial assistance departures is you got to reduce sentence. So of course your sentence length is going to be shorter. So this is what is known as an indirect relationship. So you had, you have a history of drug use, so you get a substantial assistance departure. And then because you got this substantial assistance departure, your sentence length ends up being lower. So it's not a direct relationship, it is an indirect one. I think this is really interesting. The same thing goes for pretrial detention. So because these things are related to your final sentence. And your article talks about that as well. So if you get a substantial assistance departure, this was actually in the statistical model that they didn't show you, this was predictive of sentence length, which makes sense. Also, if you're being detained prior to trial, you're more likely to get a longer sentence. So because your drug use during the commission of your crime is a predictor of pretrial detention, and pretrial detention is a predictor of your sentence length, then you have an indirect relationship wherein drug use during the commission of a crime is significantly related to this. So drug use during the crime causes pretrial detention. Pretrial detention then causes you to have a longer sentence length, if that makes more sense to you all. And then, like I said, the same thing works for the history of drug use. So all in all, I think this article is really interesting. I think that it is a bit on the complex side for what you guys are looking at. And don't worry, I'm not going to make you guys tell me what explain this indirect relationship and things like that. I don't expect you to know all of those sorts of things. But I think one good takeaway from this is sometimes you have things that are not directly related to each other. So, one thing that I've studied and I've published on in the past has been drunk driving and fatal alcohol, crashes. And so an indirect relationship there is we're actually looking at DUI arrests. So does the number of DUI arrests, is that related to alcohol-related crashes? Well, maybe not directly, right? Because you think about the more people you arrest, the less people are going to drink and drive. And then, as a result of that, you're going to have less drunk driving related crashes, right? So it's an indirect relationship where you have one thing causes something that causes something else. And it can go further and longer than that as it is. I hope that makes some help for you all to try to understand this idea of an indirect relationship. And had they have just tested the direct relationships, they would have found that there's no influence on sentence length. But that's one of the interesting things about that paper, that they did test these indirect relationships and found that the path was there. It was just indirect. I actually am working on something now where we found that with juveniles, but I'm not going to go into too much detail there. Anyway, so talking about juveniles, sentencing transferred juveniles in adult court. This is Lehman, Chiricos, and Bales. This is the second article in your textbook at the end of the chapter there. So the purpose of this study is they wanted to look at race and ethnicity and see if an individual's race and ethnicity influenced their sentence when they were waived to juvenile adult court. And so this kind of talks about a little bit about, the focal concerns perspective, offender blameworthiness, protection of the community, practical constraints. It actually gets into some of the minority threat literature as well. We won't go too much into that though. But one of the big things that I want you guys to think about here is, they had a couple of different dependent variables. They had prison sentence, they had jail sentence, they had supervision. So you're just, you're on probation or something like that. And then they looked at the prison sentence length again, kind of similar to the previous article. And so what they ended up finding was that black and Hispanic offenders, juveniles, who were waived to adult court. And we haven't talked about the juvenile system in this class because it's more of a juvenile justice issue, but basically what happens is if you commit a pretty serious crime, if it would have been a felony if you're an adult, what can happen is the juvenile court can say, okay, well, we're waiving our jurisdiction over this person and we're sending you on to adult court. This happens a lot when juveniles commit murders and things like that. They're saying, well, these are more serious crimes, because juvenile court, they can only keep you in most states until you're 21 and then they have to let you go. So a lot of these offenses will be waived or transferred, so to speak, to adult court. And this is an analysis of those people that have been waived to adult court. Anyway, so black and Hispanic offenders were more likely to have a jail sentence compared to the community supervision, like probation or something like that. And then black offenders were more likely to get a prison sentence compared to, getting the community supervision and compared to white offenders. Hispanic was not really related, or it wasn't statistically significantly related to prison sentences. And then if you look at the sentence length, so once you got sentenced to prison, was the length of your sentence longer for blacks and Hispanic compared to white offenders? And they found that for black offenders, they did have a significantly longer sentence than the white offenders. However, there was not any significant difference that they found between Hispanic offenders and white offenders. So those are interesting things to think about, right? So we see that we're finding some kind of racial bias in the sentencing processes here. And this is a pretty recent article. And, this is not from, what you would usually consider to be one of the southern states that you might often find this in. This is in Florida. So think whatever you want there. People, there's a funny comedian that has this, if you Google it, that's, I can't remember the name of the comedian, but he talks about the southern accent and the different ones across different states, and he's like, then you get south of Gainesville, Florida, and the southern accent just disappears. Anyway, little side story. Maybe I'll find that for you guys and show you next week. Anyway, but it's really a funny video. Anyway, so when you look at interaction effects, they tested some interaction effects. And I know this is probably, you guys are like, what? I don't understand what the previous slide was talking about. But basically what they were looking at was, okay, we already know that race is important. Well, in our model, we actually controlled for gender as well. And we found that males are punished more harshly than females are, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or age. It doesn't matter, males get a harsher penalty. So, and you guys can go and read the literature where they talk about the previous studies that have found similar things like this too. I'm not going to go through all of that for either one of these articles because you guys can read that. That's pretty accessible, and I'd be here talking for quite a while if we went through all of that, but you can easily read that. But there's literature that shows that actually race and gender tend to interact, and what that means is that pretty much we're testing whether race and gender, does a member of a certain race and a certain gender get punished more harshly than the others. And what they found out was that black males are punished more harshly than all the members of all of the other genders. So, for example, black females would be punished less harshly than the black males. White males would be punished less harshly than black males. Hispanic males would be punished less harshly. Hispanic females would be punished less harshly. So when you're looking at this, it's very interesting. And they tried testing this interaction with age to see if the age actually mattered of the black males to determine, well, maybe we treat, or maybe we don't treat the younger black males at like 8-year-olds old quite as harsh as those that are maybe 17 or 18, but they found that was actually, that didn't matter. That the interaction was not significant for age. So regardless of your age, if you're a juvenile in Florida during this time, you're predicted to have a much more harsh penalty if you're a black male. And this is quite disturbing, right? This is while controlling for a host of other things, your criminal history, the seriousness of your defense or your offense, and several other things. And so, I think that this is, and these are recent articles too. These are not, from the 1950s and 60s and times like that. This is, I believe it was 2000 to 2010 is when these data were collected, and so we're seeing this. It's not only, as we saw in the first article, we're finding that these things are occurring at the adult level, but we're actually finding it for juveniles as well who are waived to the adult court. And as you saw in the articles, that talked about a lot of the previous literature, this is not something that this, just these couple of articles picked up on. It's quite prolific, and it is a big concern for sentencing in the United States. So with that, that was all that I had that I was going to talk about. Of course, if you guys have any questions, let me know, and I'll do my best. But with that, I will bid you adieu and talk to you all next week.